The cabin had already gone quiet when the argument began. A well-dressed passenger stood in the aisle, pointing toward a black man seated calmly in an economy window seat. "I am not sitting next to him." The words carried across 3 rows. A flight attendant stepped in not to calm the situation, but to solve it the fastest way she could. She turned to the quiet passenger. "Sir, please collect your belongings, we need to move you." He looked up only once. "My boarding pass says this is my seat." "It is no longer available." Around them, people lowered their eyes, a few lifted their phones, no one spoke. The man folded the magazine in his lap, picked up his jacket, and stood without raising his voice. The loud passenger smiled, believing he had won. The crew believed the delay was over. They chose the wrong person, they just didn't know it yet. Morning light filtered through the tall glass walls of the terminal as travelers moved steadily toward their departure gates. Some hurried with coffee in one hand and luggage in the other. Others sat quietly near the windows, watching aircraft push back from the gates one after another. It was an ordinary travel day, busy but organized, with the familiar rhythm of announcements, boarding calls, and rolling suitcases echoing across the concourse. At Gate 22, passengers for Flight 318 gathered in small groups. Families counted backpacks. Business travelers answered emails. A young couple compared hotel reservations on a phone while an elderly man carefully folded his newspaper before placing it into his carry-on bag. Among them stood a tall black man in his early 50s. His clothes were simple but well cared for. A dark jacket rested over a light blue shirt and a small leather travel bag hung from one shoulder. There was nothing expensive or flashy about him. He carried himself with quiet confidence, never demanding attention, never rushing. He checked the departure screen once, then slipped his boarding pass back into his jacket pocket. His movements were calm, almost practiced. Instead of joining the crowd pressing closer to the boarding line, he stepped aside near the windows overlooking the runway. From there, he watched a baggage crew finish loading containers into another aircraft. For several moments, he said nothing. Around him, conversations continued without interruption. The boarding announcement finally came over the speakers. Passengers requiring assistance boarded first, followed by premium cabins. Soon afterward, Group 3 was invited to approach the gate. The man joined the line without hesitation. The gate agent smiled briefly as she scanned his boarding pass. "Have a pleasant flight." "Thank you," he replied softly. He walked down the jet bridge at the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the morning. Inside the aircraft, the cabin felt familiar. Flight attendants welcomed passengers while helping them locate overhead bin space. Some travelers searched for seat numbers, others apologized as they squeezed into their rows. The man found row 24. Window seat. Exactly as printed on his boarding pass. He placed his leather bag carefully beneath the seat in front of him before sitting down. He buckled his seat belt immediately, then rested both hands loosely in his lap. There was no sign of impatience. No unnecessary movement. No attempt to claim extra space. He simply settled in. Outside the window, ground crews continued preparing the aircraft for departure. Across the aisle, 2 college students discussed an upcoming exam. Behind him, a mother quietly entertained her young daughter with a coloring book. Everything felt ordinary. One flight attendant passed through the aisle checking overhead compartments. Her eyes paused briefly on the man before continuing down the cabin. Nothing was said. A few minutes later, another crew member stopped near row 24. "Sir, is your bag completely under the seat?" "Yes." She looked for another second before nodding. "Thank you." She continued walking. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Most passengers would have forgotten it immediately. The man did. He opened the Airline magazine resting inside the seat pocket and quietly turned the first page. Boarding continued. People filled the remaining seats row by row. Near the front of the cabin, voices occasionally rose as passengers negotiated overhead luggage space, but nothing unusual happened. The captain welcomed everyone over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Boarding is progressing smoothly and we expect an on-time departure." The announcement ended. Seat belts clicked. More passengers entered. Then a sharply dressed man appeared in the aisle. He wore an expensive tailored suit and carried himself with visible confidence. His watch caught the cabin lights as he checked his boarding pass while walking toward the rear of the aircraft. Several passengers shifted their knees to let him pass. He stopped beside row 24. He glanced at the aisle seat. Then the middle seat. Finally, his eyes settled on the quiet man by the window. His expression changed almost instantly. Not confusion. Not surprise. Something colder. He looked down again at his boarding pass before looking back toward the seated passenger. Without speaking, he remained standing in the aisle. Passengers behind him began waiting for the line to move. A flight attendant noticed the delay and walked over. "Can I help you locate your seat, sir?" The well-dressed passenger kept staring toward the window seat. "This is my row." "Yes, sir." He pointed toward the quiet man. "I won't be sitting here." The flight attendant blinked. "I'm sorry. I said I won't be sitting next to him." The surrounding conversations faded almost immediately. Several nearby passengers looked up. The quiet man slowly closed the magazine in his lap. He did not look at the man standing above him. He did not speak. He simply waited. The flight attendant offered a polite smile, assuming it was a simple seating concern. "Is there a problem with the seat?" The passenger answered without lowering his voice. "There is a problem with who is sitting in it." A silence settled over the row. No one moved. No one interrupted. The flight attendant looked from one passenger to the other, realizing this was no ordinary seating complaint. For the first time that morning, the calm rhythm of boarding came to a stop. The aircraft doors remained open. Passengers in the aisle could go no farther. And although no one understood exactly where the situation was heading, an uncomfortable feeling spread quietly through the cabin. Something had just changed. The silence lingered for only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Passengers standing in the aisle shifted their weight, unsure whether to continue waiting or step aside. Those already seated looked toward row 24, trying to understand why boarding had suddenly stopped. The flight attendant kept her voice steady. "Sir, could you explain what the issue is?" The man in the tailored suit folded his boarding pass and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I already have. I'm afraid I don't understand." He looked directly at the quiet passenger by the window. "I am not sitting next to him." This time there was no misunderstanding. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. The flight attendant hesitated. She had handled disagreements over reclining seats, overhead luggage, and children kicking seatbacks. This felt different. She lowered her voice. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" "I'll speak right here." His answer was loud enough for several nearby rows to hear. "I paid for this ticket. I expect a comfortable flight." The quiet man remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the closed magazine. He said nothing. The flight attendant looked at him briefly. "Sir, have the two of you spoken before?" "No." "Has there been any disagreement?" "No." His answers were short and respectful. "Nothing more." She turned back toward the standing passenger. "Then I don't understand the concern." The man let out a slow breath. "My concern is exactly what you see." The meaning landed heavily. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Others stared openly, unable to believe what they were hearing. An older woman across the aisle quietly shook her head. A young father sitting 2 rows behind looked toward his wife without saying a word. Still no one intervened. The flight attendant maintained her professional expression, though uncertainty had begun to show. "Sir, we do not move passengers for reasons like this." The suited passenger smiled faintly. "I'm not asking you to move me." He nodded toward the window seat. "Move him." The words hung in the air. The quiet passenger slowly lifted his eyes for the first time. He looked at the flight attendant, not at the man demanding his removal. "My boarding pass matches this seat." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Yes, sir," she replied. He nodded once, then returned to silence. For a brief moment, it seemed the discussion might end there. The flight attendant appeared ready to tell the standing passenger that the seating assignment would remain unchanged. Then another problem appeared. Passengers were still boarding. The line had stretched deep into the jet bridge. People could no longer reach their rows because the aisle was blocked. A second flight attendant approached. "Everything all right?" The first attendant answered quietly. "We have a seating issue." The second attendant looked around before speaking softly. "We're already running close on boarding." The first attendant understood exactly what she meant. Every additional minute increased pressure. The departure slot had been assigned. Ground crews were waiting. The captain expected the cabin to be secured soon. What had begun as one passenger's discriminatory demand was slowly becoming an operational delay. The suited passenger seemed to recognize the growing pressure. He remained perfectly still. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. The longer he waited, the more people waited with him. The cabin became increasingly uncomfortable. The first flight attendant made a decision. Not a final one. A temporary one. At least that was how she justified it to herself. She leaned slightly toward the quiet passenger. "Sir." He looked up. "Would you mind stepping into the aisle for just a moment while we sort this out?" He studied her expression. There was no anger in her face. Only urgency. She wanted movement. She wanted boarding to continue. She wanted the problem to disappear. Unfortunately, the easiest solution seemed to involve the person causing no trouble at all. The man stood without complaint. He stepped into the aisle and waited beside his row. The suited passenger watched silently. Several nearby travelers noticed what had happened. The person who had created the conflict remained exactly where he wanted. The person who had followed every rule was now standing. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The flight attendant spoke quietly. "Thank you for your cooperation." He answered with a small nod. "Nothing else. No complaint. No protest. No accusation." His restraint made the moment feel even heavier. Across the aisle, the older woman finally spoke. "He's sitting in his assigned seat." Her voice was soft but clear. The flight attendant offered a polite smile. "We're trying to resolve everything as quickly as possible, ma'am." The woman looked unconvinced but said no more. Further back in the cabin, someone discreetly lifted a phone. Another passenger did the same. Neither recorded openly. Neither wanted attention. But both sensed they were witnessing something that deserved to be remembered. The second flight attendant quietly whispered to her colleague. "Should we call the lead?" "I think we have to." She reached for the interphone near the galley. Within moments, the lead flight attendant began walking down the aisle from the front of the aircraft. Her pace was calm, but her expression was serious. She quickly took in the scene. The standing passenger. The quiet man beside the row. The blocked aisle. The waiting travelers. The phones that disappeared the moment she looked in their direction. She listened as the first attendant summarized the situation in a low voice. When the explanation ended, the lead attendant remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked at the quiet passenger. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" He handed it to her immediately. She examined it carefully. Row 24. Window seat. Everything matched perfectly. She returned the pass. "Thank you." No mistake. No duplicate assignment. No computer error. The seat belonged to him. The lead attendant knew that. Everyone involved knew that. Yet the aircraft still had not moved. She glanced toward the cockpit door. Departure time was approaching. Every passing minute narrowed their options. And for the first time, the possibility entered her mind that resolving this situation might require someone beyond the cabin crew. Someone with greater authority. Someone whose arrival would change the tone of everything that followed. The lead flight attendant remained still for a moment, weighing her options. She looked once more at the boarding pass in the quiet man's hand. There was no mistake. His ticket was valid. His seat assignment was correct. He had boarded normally. He had followed every instruction. The problem had never been him. Yet the aisle remained blocked. More passengers continued arriving from the jet bridge, only to stop several rows behind the growing crowd. Bags brushed against armrests as people tried to make room for one another. The aircraft felt smaller with every passing minute. The lead attendant kept her voice measured. "Sir," she said to the man in the tailored suit, "your assigned seat is here. If you choose not to take it, we can discuss other available options after boarding is complete." The man folded his arms. "There are no other options. There may be open seats once everyone has boarded. I am not waiting." His answer came without hesitation. "I will not sit beside him." Again, several nearby passengers heard every word. The quiet man stood beside his row with his jacket draped over one arm. He did not interrupt. His face revealed almost nothing, but his eyes moved carefully around the cabin, taking in the reactions of the people nearby. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked angry. Most simply looked away. A businessman in the row behind lowered his laptop screen and watched silently. Across the aisle, the older woman who had spoken earlier tightened her grip on the armrest. The lead attendant tried another approach. "Sir, discrimination toward another passenger is not an acceptable reason to refuse your assigned seat." The suited passenger met her eyes. "I'm not asking for your opinion." His voice remained controlled, but the firmness behind it carried through the cabin. "I'm telling you what will happen." He glanced toward the front of the aircraft. "If this isn't resolved, your flight won't leave on time." The statement landed exactly as he intended. Everyone knew delays created pressure. Schedules slipped. Connections were missed. Complaints increased. Crew members faced questions from operations. The lead attendant understood all of that. She also understood something else. Every minute spent arguing in the aisle increased the likelihood that someone would choose the quickest solution rather than the right one. She looked toward the quiet passenger. "Sir, would you mind waiting near the front galley while we continue working on this?" The request was polite. The effect was not. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The man who had done nothing wrong was being asked to leave his place again. The quiet passenger paused for the first time. Not in anger. In thought. Then he answered. "If that's your instruction, I'll comply." His voice remained calm. He picked up his small leather bag from beneath the seat and stepped into the aisle. No complaint. No visible frustration. He simply followed directions. As he walked toward the front of the cabin, dozens of eyes followed him. The suited passenger remained exactly where he was. He had not been asked to move. He had not been asked to step aside. He had not even been asked to lower his voice. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. Near row 18, a teenage passenger quietly whispered to his mother. "Why are they moving him?" His mother answered softly. "I don't know." But her expression suggested she did. At the front galley, the quiet man stood beside the service area, keeping clear of the crew's workspace. One of the junior flight attendants approached him. "I'm sorry for the delay." "It's all right. We're trying to resolve it." "I understand." His answers remained brief. Respectful. Controlled. The attendant seemed almost surprised by his composure. Most passengers removed from their assigned seat would have demanded an explanation by now. He did not. Instead, he looked out through the open aircraft door toward the jet bridge, where the final passengers were still waiting to board. His attention drifted briefly to the operations staff outside. Then back to the cabin. Nothing about his behavior suggested panic. If anything, he seemed unusually patient. Back in row 24, the lead attendant quietly spoke with the suited passenger once more. "We cannot require another passenger to surrender a valid seat for the reason you've given." The man shrugged. "Then solve it another way." "There may not be another way." "There always is." He sat down in the aisle seat without fastening his belt, making it clear he considered the discussion unfinished. Boarding finally resumed. Passengers carefully squeezed past him, aware of the tension but unwilling to become part of it. Some offered sympathetic looks toward the front galley as they passed the quiet man. Others avoided eye contact entirely. No one wanted to be involved. One young woman, however, discreetly continued recording with her phone held low against her handbag. She captured only fragments. The empty window seat. The waiting passenger. The repeated conversations between crew members. No dramatic confrontation. Just a steady record of what was happening. Near the aircraft door, the gate agent stepped inside. She spoke quietly with the lead attendant. Operations wants an update. The lead attendant exhaled slowly. They're asking already. We've missed our scheduled boarding completion. The words added another layer of pressure. The captain had not yet left the cockpit. Ground control would soon begin asking questions. Every delay required documentation. Every unusual event generated reports. The lead attendant looked once more toward the quiet passenger standing patiently near the galley. He noticed her glance and offered a small, polite nod. Not demanding. Not impatient. Just waiting. That simple gesture unsettled her more than any argument could have. She had dealt with angry passengers before. She knew how to respond to shouting. She knew how to respond to threats. But calm acceptance in the face of obvious unfairness was different. It forced everyone else to confront the situation without distraction. There was nothing about his behavior they could criticize. Nothing they could point to as justification. Only the decisions being made around him. The lead attendant looked toward the cockpit door. This had moved beyond a seating dispute. The next decision would no longer belong to the cabin crew alone. Someone else would have to decide what happened next. The lead flight attendant stood quietly near the forward galley for several moments before lifting the interphone. She pressed a single button. "Captain, could you come out for a moment? We have a situation in the cabin that requires your attention." There was a brief pause. "I'll be there." She replaced the handset without another word. The junior flight attendants exchanged uncertain looks. None of them spoke. In airline operations, asking the captain to leave the cockpit before departure was unusual. It meant the issue could no longer be managed at the cabin level. The quiet passenger remained standing a few feet away. He kept one hand resting lightly on the handle of his leather bag. His expression had not changed. Outside the aircraft door, ground crew members continued loading the last pieces of luggage. Fueling had already been completed. Catering trucks had departed. Everything necessary for departure was ready. Everything except the passengers. A moment later, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the aisle wearing the calm, practiced expression of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. He nodded to the lead flight attendant. "Tell me what happened." She explained the situation carefully. She described the complaint. The refusal to sit. The blocked aisle. The growing boarding delay. She also made one point absolutely clear. "The passenger by the window has followed every instruction we've given." The captain looked toward the front galley. The quiet man met his eyes with a respectful nod. "No more." The captain walked over. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning. I understand you've been asked to leave your assigned seat temporarily." "Yes." "Has there been any disagreement between you and the other passenger?" "No." "Have you spoken to him at all?" "No." The captain studied him for another second. Everything about the man's manner was composed. No raised voice. No defensive posture. No visible frustration. If someone had entered the cabin at that moment without context, they would have assumed he was simply waiting for instructions. The captain thanked him and walked back toward row 24. The suited passenger remained seated in the aisle seat, arms crossed. "Sir," the captain began, "I've been informed you refuse to occupy your assigned seat." "I refuse to sit beside him." "May I ask why?" "You already know why." "I'd like to hear it directly from you." The passenger leaned back. "I am not comfortable sitting next to him." The captain remained silent. "Is there any reason beyond personal preference?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. The captain understood exactly what it meant. He also understood the operational reality. The aircraft was now officially delayed. Passengers had begun checking their watches. Connections at the destination would become tighter if the delay continued. Airport operations would soon require an explanation. He glanced toward the lead flight attendant. "Any open seats?" She checked the electronic seating display on her tablet. "None confirmed." "What about upgrades?" "Full." "Jump seats?" "Not permitted for passengers." The captain nodded slowly. Every routine solution had disappeared. He turned back toward the suited passenger. I need you either to occupy your assigned seat or voluntarily leave the aircraft. The man looked almost amused. So those are my only choices. Yes. I'll stay exactly where I am. Another silence settled over the cabin. Nearby passengers listened without pretending otherwise. The atmosphere had changed. This was no longer an uncomfortable disagreement. It had become an official matter. The captain stepped aside with the lead flight attendant. If he refuses, we'll have to involve airport security. Neither sounded pleased by the conclusion. It was procedure, not punishment. The captain looked once more toward the quiet passenger waiting near the front. Then toward the suited passenger refusing to cooperate. His decision should have been straightforward. Yet one concern lingered. If security arrived, they would encounter a cabin where the compliant passenger had already been removed from his assigned seat. The optics were difficult. The paperwork would be worse. Still, procedure required documentation before judgment. He spoke quietly. Call operations, tell them we'll need security if the passenger continues refusing instructions. The lead attendant nodded. She picked up the interphone again. Within minutes, the gate agent received the request. Outside the aircraft, activity subtly changed. A supervisor arrived at the gate podium. Another operations employee began making notes on a tablet. The boarding door remained open. Passengers waiting inside the terminal could see staff gathering but could not hear the conversations. Inside the cabin, the quiet passenger watched everything without appearing to watch anything. His eyes briefly followed the operations supervisor outside. Then they rested on the aircraft door. The junior flight attendant approached him again. Would you like some water while you wait? Thank you. She handed him a small bottle. He accepted it with a polite smile. Thank you for your patience. You're doing your job. The simple response caught her off guard. There was no sarcasm. No hidden accusation. Only a statement. She walked away feeling less certain than before. Across the cabin, the older woman who had spoken earlier leaned toward the businessman behind her. This isn't right. He nodded. I know. Neither raised their voice. Neither confronted the crew. Like everyone else, they watched events unfold through the narrow space between responsibility and hesitation. Near the rear of the aircraft, another passenger quietly pressed the record button on his phone. No dramatic scene filled the screen. Only people waiting. Crew members moving carefully. A captain speaking in measured tones. A quiet man standing alone near the front. Sometimes the absence of drama revealed more than shouting ever could. A few minutes later, the gate agent stepped back onto the aircraft. She approached the captain. They're on their way. The captain understood immediately. Airport security. He closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. He had hoped the situation would end before reaching this point. Instead, it had crossed another line. The quiet passenger heard the words but showed no reaction. He simply took one small sip of water and placed the bottle on a nearby service counter. Then he waited. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the jet bridge, every conversation inside the aircraft faded. The next people to enter would not know who had caused the problem. They would only see the result. And first impressions, the captain realized, often shaped everything that followed. The footsteps grew louder along the jet bridge. A moment later, two airport security officers stepped through the aircraft door, followed by an operations supervisor carrying a tablet. They entered calmly. No raised voices. No display of authority. Just measured professional movements. The captain greeted them near the entrance. Thank you for coming. One of the officers nodded. What do we have? The captain explained the situation as briefly as possible. There has been a seating dispute involving discriminatory remarks. One passenger refuses to occupy his assigned seat. Boarding has been delayed. The senior officer listened without interruption. Who is refusing? The captain glanced toward row 24. The suited passenger remained seated in the aisle, arms folded. But before the captain could continue, the operations supervisor quietly asked another question. Who has been moved from their assigned seat? The captain looked toward the front galley. The gentleman standing there. Every set of eyes turned toward the quiet man. He acknowledged them with a slight nod. Nothing more. The officers approached him first. "Sir," the senior officer said politely, "may we speak with you for a moment?" "Of course." The man stepped slightly away from the galley to avoid blocking the crew. "Can you tell us what happened?" He answered carefully. "I boarded normally." He paused. "I sat in my assigned seat." Another pause. "The passenger assigned beside me said he would not sit next to me. And then I was asked to step into the aisle while the crew addressed the situation." "Were you instructed to leave your seat?" "Yes." "Were you informed that you had violated any rule?" "No." "Were you asked for identification beyond your boarding pass?" "No." His answers remained factual. Never emotional. Never exaggerated. The officer made several notes. Then he asked one final question. "Do you wish to make a complaint at this time?" The quiet man looked briefly toward the cabin. Dozens of passengers were watching. Some openly. Others pretending not to. He answered without hesitation. "Right now, I'd prefer everyone reach their destination safely." The officer stopped writing. It was not the answer he expected. Most people in the same situation would have begun listing grievances. Instead, this passenger seemed more concerned about the delayed flight than himself. The senior officer thanked him. "We appreciate your cooperation." He nodded politely. Meanwhile, the second officer walked toward row 24. "Sir, may I speak with you?" The suited passenger remained seated. "I've already explained everything. I'd still like to hear it directly." The man sighed loudly. "I don't feel comfortable sitting beside him." The officer remained expressionless. "Can you explain why?" "I don't have to justify personal preferences." "No," the officer replied evenly, "but you do have to comply with crew instructions." "I paid for my seat." "You were offered your assigned seat." "I rejected it." The officer looked down at the electronic manifest displayed on the supervisor's tablet. "Your assigned seat is still available." "I'm not taking it." The answer came firmly. Several nearby passengers quietly exchanged glances. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. One passenger answered every question calmly. The other challenged nearly every instruction. Yet the quiet man remained standing near the front of the aircraft while the disruptive passenger still occupied his preferred place in the cabin. The older woman across the aisle finally raised her hand. "Officer." He turned. "I saw what happened." "So did I," another passenger added from 2 rows behind. Within seconds, more voices joined. "He never caused any trouble." The crew asked him to move. The other man refused to sit down. No one shouted. No one argued. They simply described what they had witnessed. The officers listened carefully. The operations supervisor began nodding seat numbers beside each willing witness. Near the aircraft door, the lead flight attendant watched silently. Each new statement made her increasingly uncomfortable. She had acted under pressure. She knew that. But hearing the sequence repeated by independent passengers made one fact impossible to ignore. Every instruction had been directed toward the cooperative passenger. Almost none had been directed toward the person creating the disruption. She replayed the decisions in her mind. First asking him to stand. Then asking him to wait in the galley. Each decision had seemed temporary. Practical. Necessary. Together they painted a different picture. One she had never intended. The captain noticed her expression. Quietly he stepped beside her. "You were trying to keep the flight moving." She nodded. "I know. But that's not how this looks now." He didn't disagree. Because it didn't only look wrong. It was becoming difficult to defend procedurally. The operations supervisor approached the captain. "We'll need written statements from the involved crew before departure." The captain looked toward the departure clock. Every passing minute increased the delay. "Understood." The supervisor continued. "And we'll also need copies of any cabin reports created before security arrived." The captain nodded again. More documentation. More review. This was growing beyond an ordinary operational delay. Near the galley, the quiet passenger reached into his jacket pocket. Not for identification. Not for a phone. He removed a small notebook and calmly wrote down the current time. Nothing else. One of the officers noticed. Keeping notes. The man smiled politely. I find it useful. The notebook disappeared back into his pocket. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet it caught the attention of the operations supervisor. Most passengers didn't document precise timelines during airline disputes. They reacted emotionally. This man observed. Recorded. Waited. There was something unusually disciplined about the way he handled every moment. Not suspicious. Simply deliberate. The supervisor found himself wondering what kind of profession taught someone to remain that composed while standing at the center of a public incident. Before he could ask, his company radio crackled. A voice spoke quietly. We need a detailed update before any decision is made. The supervisor frowned. Normally, operations wanted flights moving as quickly as possible. This time, someone higher up seemed interested in every detail. He looked once more toward the quiet passenger. The man stood exactly where he had been for nearly 20 minutes. Still calm. Still patient. Still saying almost nothing. For reasons the supervisor couldn't explain, he suddenly had the feeling that this delay was no longer the most important issue. Something much larger had quietly begun. The operations supervisor stepped into the jet bridge, pulling the aircraft door partly closed behind him to reduce the noise from the cabin. He raised the company radio. Operations to control, I'm on scene. A voice answered immediately. Give me a full status update. He summarized the incident as carefully as possible. One passenger refused to sit beside another passenger. Boarding was interrupted. Cabin crew temporarily relocated the compliant passenger while attempting to resolve the dispute. Security has now interviewed both parties. A short silence followed. Then came an unexpected question. Has anyone preserved the cabin timeline? The supervisor frowned. The timeline. Who gave which instruction and when? He glanced back through the aircraft doorway. Not completely, we're still gathering statements. Start now. The transmission ended. The request stayed with him. Usually, operations focused on departure times, gate availability, and missed connections. This time, someone wanted sequence. Not opinions. Not conclusions. Just facts. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere remained unusually quiet. Passengers had stopped asking when they would leave. Instead, many simply watched. The tension had shifted. People were no longer waiting for an argument. They were waiting for a decision. The captain remained near the cockpit, speaking quietly with the lead flight attendant. Walk me through everything again. She took a slow breath. He boarded without incident. She pointed toward the front galley. He sat in row 24. She continued carefully. The other passenger refused to sit beside him. You confirmed the seat assignment. Immediately. It was correct. Yes. The captain nodded. Then why wasn't the refusing passenger removed from the aircraft? The question lingered. The lead attendant answered honestly. I believed moving the cooperative passenger temporarily would reduce the delay. The captain looked down for a moment. It did the opposite. She didn't argue. Because he was right. Every attempt to avoid conflict had quietly rewarded the person creating it. Nearby, one of the junior flight attendants overheard the conversation. She replayed the morning in her own mind. She remembered checking whether the quiet man's bag was completely under the seat. She remembered asking him to step into the aisle. She remembered thanking him for cooperating. He had complied with every request. Without exception. Yet each act of cooperation had led to another request. Another inconvenience. Another removal from the place where he had every right to remain. The realization settled heavily on her. At the front of the cabin, the quiet passenger accepted another bottle of water. Thank you. The junior attendant hesitated. I'm sorry you've had to wait. He looked at her kindly. I know this wasn't how you expected your morning to go. She blinked. Neither was it how he had expected his. Yet he had chosen to acknowledge hers instead. She wasn't sure how to respond. She simply nodded and walked away. Outside the aircraft, two airport managers arrived at the gate. They spoke quietly with the operations supervisor. One of them held a printed copy of the flight manifest. The other carried a folder containing company procedures for onboard incidents. Neither looked rushed. That alone felt unusual. Inside the cabin, several passengers noticed the growing number of airline officials gathering outside the aircraft door. What are they doing? No idea. It seems serious. Phones remained tucked away now. People sensed that the situation had moved beyond social media. Whatever happened next would happen through the airline itself. The operations supervisor returned to the aircraft. He approached the captain. Corporate operations has requested copies of every report before departure. The captain raised an eyebrow. Before departure? Yes. That's unusual. I know. The supervisor lowered his voice. They're asking for details we normally submit after the flight. The captain looked toward the front galley again. His instincts had begun telling him the same thing. Someone above airport operations was paying very close attention. Without announcing it. Without interfering. Simply watching. The senior security officer walked over carrying a small notebook. I've finished speaking with witnesses. What did they say? The captain asked. They're remarkably consistent. How so? They all describe one passenger remaining calm. He glanced toward the quiet man. And they all describe the other passenger refusing multiple opportunities to comply. The captain nodded slowly. No significant differences. Only one. What is it? The witnesses remember almost every instruction given to the cooperative passenger. The officer closed his notebook. They remember very few instructions being given to the disruptive one. The words landed heavily. Because they reflected exactly what had happened. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But undeniably. The system had focused its attention on the easier person to manage. The compliant passenger had become the convenient solution. Until the consequences of that decision became impossible to ignore. The operations supervisor's phone vibrated. He checked the screen. An internal number. He answered quietly. Operations. The caller spoke for nearly 30 seconds. The supervisor's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for the captain to notice. I understand. He ended the call. What is it? The captain asked. The supervisor chose his words carefully. Someone from headquarters has requested that no final decision be made until they review the initial reports. The captain looked surprised. Headquarters? Yes. Do they know the passenger involved? I wasn't told. Then why are they interested? The supervisor gave a small shake of his head. I honestly don't know. Across the cabin, the quiet passenger looked through the aircraft window toward the terminal. A service vehicle passed slowly beneath the wing. Ground crew continued working on neighboring flights. The airport moved with its usual rhythm. Only this aircraft remained still. He reached into his jacket once more. This time he removed nothing. He simply checked that something inside the pocket was still there before letting his hand fall again. A small movement. Easy to miss. But the operations supervisor happened to notice it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wondering whether the man had been expecting something like this all along. Not the discrimination. Not the humiliation. But the moment when procedures would finally matter more than assumptions. The supervisor looked down at the growing stack of notes in his hands. Every page told the same story. No shouting. No threats. No resistance. Only decisions. One after another. Each made under pressure. Each seeming reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a pattern. And somewhere beyond the airport, someone had begun asking very careful questions about that pattern. The answers, the supervisor suspected, were about to reach people far above everyone standing inside the cabin. The aircraft had now been at the gate far longer than anyone had expected. Through the cabin windows, passengers could see another aircraft taxi past, followed by a line of service vehicles crossing the ramp. Around them, the airport continued operating almost normally. Only Flight 318 remained frozen in place. Inside the terminal, the gate information screen quietly changed from on time to delayed. No announcement explained why. Inside the cabin, conversations had become little more than whispers. No one seemed impatient anymore. The atmosphere had changed from frustration to observation. People were waiting to see whether the airline would follow its own rules. The operations supervisor sat in an empty seat near the front of the aircraft, organizing his notes. He arranged them in order. Time of boarding. Seat verification. Passenger refusal. Crew instructions. Removal from the assigned seat. Arrival of security. Witness interviews. He deliberately avoided adding opinions. Only facts. Every event was placed exactly where it belonged. When he finished, he transmitted the report electronically. Within less than 2 minutes, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Corporate operations. That was unusually fast. He answered immediately. This is Martin. A calm voice spoke on the other end. We've received your timeline. Yes. Is it complete? As complete as I can make it. Were there any violations by the passenger who was removed from his assigned seat? Martin glanced toward the quiet man near the galley. None that we've identified. Any refusal to follow crew instructions? No. Any disruptive behavior? No. The caller paused. And you're certain? I'm certain. Another brief silence followed. Stay where you are, additional reviewers are joining this case. The line disconnected. Martin lowered the phone slowly. Additional reviewers. That phrase stayed with him. Normally, incidents like this were resolved locally. The airport management team handled the paperwork. The flight departed. The review happened later. Today, everything was happening before the aircraft had even left the gate. Near the front of the cabin, the senior security officer approached the quiet passenger again. Sir, thank you for your patience. You're welcome. I have one additional question. Go ahead. Have you flown with this airline before? The man smiled faintly. Many times. Have you ever experienced anything similar? No. The officer nodded. I appreciate your honesty. The man gave the same calm response he had given throughout the morning. I'm simply answering your questions. Nothing more. Nothing less. A few rows back, the older woman who had spoken earlier quietly addressed the lead flight attendant. I know you're under pressure. The attendant looked at her. But pressure isn't the same as fairness. The words were not spoken with anger. They were spoken with disappointment. The attendant accepted them without argument. Because there was nothing she could reasonably say. Meanwhile, the suited passenger had become noticeably quieter. His confidence remained, but the atmosphere around him had shifted. Earlier, he had believed time was working in his favor. Now it seemed to be working against him. Every additional minute brought another manager. Another report. Another witness. No one was discussing seat changes anymore. They were discussing procedures. Near the aircraft door, the captain received another call. This time it came through the secure company line. He listened carefully. Understood. A pause. Yes, all involved personnel are still present. Another pause. I'll make sure no one leaves until instructed. He ended the call. The lead flight attendant noticed his expression. More questions. He nodded. They want everyone to remain available. For what? They didn't say. Outside the aircraft, 2 members of the airline's regional management team arrived at the gate. Neither wore airport uniforms. Both carried company identification badges and slim document cases. They spoke quietly with the operations supervisor before stepping onto the aircraft. Their arrival immediately changed the mood among the crew. This level of management almost never responded personally to a delayed boarding incident. One of the managers introduced himself to the captain. We're here to review the initial findings. The captain handed over copies of the reports. The manager read silently for several moments. He occasionally underlined a sentence with his finger. Then he looked up. Has the passenger who was removed from his assigned seat made any formal complaint? No. Requested legal representation? No. Threatened media involvement? No. The manager looked genuinely surprised. No. The captain shook his head. None. The manager closed the report. Interesting. He walked toward the quiet passenger. Sir, my name is Daniel, I'm with Regional Operations. The man nodded politely. Good afternoon. I'd like to apologize for the delay. Thank you. Daniel waited. He expected criticism, frustration, a demand. Instead, the man simply stood there calmly. Finally, Daniel asked, Is there anything you would like from us right now? The answer came after only a brief pause. I'd like everyone to base their decisions on what actually happened. Daniel looked at him carefully. No assumptions. No assumptions. The simplicity of the request caught him off guard. There was no attempt to influence the investigation. Only a request that facts be allowed to speak for themselves. Daniel stepped back toward the captain. Quietly he said, There's something unusual here. What do you mean? I've handled hundreds of passenger complaints. He glanced toward the man standing by the galley. I've never seen someone this calm after being treated this way. The captain answered honestly. Neither have I. A notification suddenly appeared on Daniel's company tablet. He opened it. The message was short. Case status updated. Executive Compliance Division has assumed oversight. Continue preserving all documentation. Do not close the incident locally. Daniel read it twice. Then a third time. He looked slowly toward the quiet passenger. Executive Compliance Division almost never became involved before an aircraft departed. Someone far above regional management had taken control. Yet no one had explained why. Daniel locked the tablet without saying a word. Around him, the crew sensed that another shift had taken place. Not a public one. Not an emotional one. A procedural one. The kind that quietly changed everything long before anyone understood the reason. And for the first time since boarding had begun, the people making decisions realized they were no longer the highest authority involved. Daniel stood motionless for a few seconds, the tablet still in his hand. The message remained fresh in his mind. Executive Compliance Division has assumed oversight. It was not a routine instruction. It meant the incident had crossed into a level of corporate review that very few employees ever encountered. He looked toward the operations supervisor. Has anyone from Executive Compliance contacted the airport directly? Martin shook his head. Not yet. Daniel nodded slowly. They will. Inside the cabin, nothing appeared to have changed. Passengers remained seated. The crew continued waiting. The captain stood near the cockpit. The quiet passenger remained beside the forward galley. To anyone walking past the aircraft, it would have looked like an ordinary delay. Only those inside knew how much had happened without anyone raising a voice. A few minutes later, Daniel's phone rang. He stepped into the jet bridge before answering. Daniel speaking. The caller identified herself immediately. This is Executive Compliance. Her tone was calm. Professional. We've reviewed the preliminary reports. Yes. We have one question. Daniel opened his notebook. I'm ready. Has the passenger identified himself at any point? Daniel frowned. No. Has anyone asked who he is beyond verifying his boarding pass? No. There was a brief silence. Then please do not ask. Daniel looked confused. I'm sorry. Continue documenting events exactly as they occur. But do not change your handling of the situation because of who the passenger is. The line went quiet for a moment. Then she added one final sentence. We're interested in what your procedures produce without outside influence. The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Someone already knew exactly who the quiet passenger was. And they wanted the investigation to continue naturally. No special treatment. No shortcuts. No warning to the crew. Just an honest record of every decision that had already been made. Daniel walked back into the aircraft. His expression had changed. Not because he knew the man's identity. He still didn't. But because he now understood something important. The passenger had never intended to use his position to stop what was happening. He had allowed the system to reveal itself. Near the galley, the quiet man remained where he had been for nearly an hour. The junior flight attendant approached once more. "Sir." He looked up. "I know we've thanked you already, but..." She hesitated. "I truly am sorry." He gave a small understanding smile. "I appreciate you saying that." There was no bitterness in his voice. Only sincerity. The attendant walked away feeling both relieved and ashamed. Daniel's tablet vibrated again. This time a secure video meeting request appeared. He accepted it. The screen showed a senior executive seated in a conference room at company headquarters. Daniel recognized him immediately. He was the airline's chief compliance officer. "Good afternoon," the executive said. "Good afternoon. I understand the situation remains unresolved." "Yes." The executive nodded. "I believe it's time to conclude the uncertainty." Daniel waited. The executive continued. "The passenger standing near your forward galley has been traveling anonymously for the past several months." Daniel remained silent. He has been evaluating operational consistency across the network. A pause. "He has done this before." Daniel slowly lowered into an empty jump seat. The executive spoke one final sentence. "The passenger is the owner of this airline." For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. He replayed the entire morning in his mind. The boarding pass. The calm answers. The notebook. The complete lack of threats. The refusal to reveal anything about himself. None of it had been accidental. Yet none of it had been manipulative either. The owner had never asked for different treatment. He had accepted exactly the treatment given to an ordinary passenger. Nothing more. Nothing less. The chief compliance officer continued. He instructed us not to interfere unless safety became an issue. Daniel finally spoke. "So this entire review is based only on the actions taken before anyone knew who he was?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because that's the only way to measure the integrity of a system." The screen went dark. The meeting ended. Daniel remained seated for another moment before standing. He looked through the cabin. The captain still believed he was handling a difficult delay. The crew believed they were waiting for operational guidance. The security officers believed they were assisting with a passenger dispute. None of them knew. Not yet. Daniel walked quietly toward the captain. "We've received confirmation from headquarters." The captain looked up. "About what?" Daniel lowered his voice. "I need to speak with you privately." The two men stepped into the front galley. Daniel showed him the secure authorization displayed on the tablet. The captain read it once. Then again. His face lost its color. He looked instinctively toward the quiet passenger. The man happened to be looking out the aircraft window, completely unaware that the captain had just learned the truth. Or perhaps, completely aware. The captain whispered, "Why didn't he tell us?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because he wanted to know how we would treat someone who couldn't rely on status." The captain looked across the cabin. Every decision made that morning now carried a different weight. Not because the passenger owned the airline, but because every decision had been made before anyone believed he mattered. And that, the captain realized, was exactly what the investigation had been designed to reveal. The hardest conversations were no longer ahead. They had already begun the moment the crew chose convenience over fairness. The captain remained silent for several moments after Daniel lowered the tablet. He had managed flight diversions, medical emergencies, severe weather, and mechanical delays during his career. None of those moments felt like this. Those situations demanded quick decisions. This one demanded honest reflection. He looked toward the quiet passenger again. The man stood exactly where he had been asked to wait. He had not approached anyone. He had not revealed his identity. He had not tried to influence a single decision. Everything the crew had done that morning had been done without knowing who he was. And that fact could never be changed. Daniel spoke first. "We need to finish this correctly." The captain nodded. "Agreed. No shortcuts. No. And no special treatment because we know who he is." The captain understood. The point of the investigation had never been the passenger's position. It had been the airline's response to an ordinary traveler facing discrimination. The procedures had to remain the same. Only now, every decision would be examined far more closely. The senior security officer joined them. "Is there an update?" Daniel answered carefully. "There is." He did not mention ownership. "Not yet. Corporate has instructed us to complete every required step before departure." The officer nodded. "That matches what we've documented." He opened his notebook. The refusing passenger declined multiple lawful crew instructions. He turned another page. The removed passenger complied with every request. Another page. Multiple independent witnesses confirmed the same sequence of events. Daniel looked through the notes. There were no contradictions. No confusion. No missing pieces. The facts had settled into place. The captain walked toward row 24. The suited passenger looked up with visible impatience. Finally, the captain remained composed. "Sir, I need your attention." "What now?" "You have refused repeated crew instructions to occupy your assigned seat." "I've explained why." "You have." The captain paused briefly. "And your explanation does not justify refusing those instructions." The man's expression hardened. "So what's your solution?" The captain answered evenly. "My solution is to end the disruption." He looked toward the security officers. "This passenger will not be traveling on this flight." The cabin fell completely silent. The officers stepped forward. "Sir, please collect your belongings." The man laughed once. "You're removing me." "Yes." "For what?" The senior officer answered calmly. "For refusing lawful crew instructions after multiple opportunities to comply." The man stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." No one argued with him. No one raised a voice. The officer simply waited. Realizing there would be no debate, he reached into the overhead compartment and removed his suitcase. As he walked toward the front, he glanced at the quiet passenger. For the first time since boarding, the two men made direct eye contact. The quiet man said nothing. He neither smiled nor frowned. He simply watched. The suited passenger looked away first. Moments later, the aircraft door closed behind him. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere changed immediately. Not because anyone celebrated. No one did. Instead, there was a quiet sense that the situation had finally begun moving in the right direction. The older woman across the aisle exhaled slowly. The businessman behind her closed his laptop. Several passengers returned their phones to their pockets. The focus was no longer on conflict. It was on accountability. Daniel approached the quiet passenger. "Sir." "Yes." "Your assigned seat is available." The man nodded. "Thank you." He picked up his leather bag and walked back toward row 24. There was no dramatic pause. No symbolic moment. He simply returned to the seat that had always belonged to him. He placed his bag beneath the seat. Fastened his seat belt. Rested his hands in his lap. Exactly as he had done when he first boarded. The cabin watched quietly. Some passengers offered small smiles as he passed. He acknowledged each with a polite nod. Nothing more. The lead flight attendant approached his row. For a moment, she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she spoke honestly. "Sir, I owe you an apology." He looked at her. She continued. "I focused on solving the delay instead of protecting the passenger who had done nothing wrong." The cabin remained silent. He answered gently. "I know you were under pressure." She nodded. "That's true. But pressure doesn't excuse poor judgment." Those words came from her. Not from him. He simply replied. "We all make decisions under pressure." She lowered her eyes. "Some decisions matter more than others." He offered a small nod. I hope today's will help improve tomorrow's. She thanked him quietly before walking away. Near the aircraft door, Daniel received one final message from headquarters. Preserve all documentation. Formal review begins immediately after landing. No employee involved would be dismissed that afternoon. There would be interviews, training reviews, policy evaluations, a careful examination of why the easiest solution had repeatedly targeted the most cooperative passenger. The consequences would unfold through procedure, not emotion, exactly as the airline's policies required. The system had finally begun correcting itself. And the quiet passenger who had never demanded justice for himself had ensured that the system would now have to provide it for everyone who traveled after him. The aircraft door closed once again. This time no one stood in the aisle. No one argued. No one questioned the seating assignments. The cabin settled into the familiar routine that should have begun nearly 2 hours earlier. The lead flight attendant completed her final safety checks, moving through the aisle with slower, more deliberate steps than before. When she reached row 24, she paused for a brief moment. The quiet passenger looked out the window toward the runway. He acknowledged her with a polite nod. She returned it and continued walking. There was nothing left to say. Not before departure. The captain returned to the cockpit. Before closing the door, he looked back through the cabin one last time. His eyes stopped at row 24. He remembered every decision that had led to this moment. Not one of them had been made with bad intentions. Yet intentions alone had not protected the passenger who deserved protection. That realization stayed with him. He closed the cockpit door. Minutes later, the aircraft pushed back from the gate. The delayed journey finally began. The flight itself was remarkably quiet. Cabin service proceeded normally. Passengers spoke in low voices. Many spent the flight reading or looking out the windows. Occasionally, someone glanced toward row 24. The quiet passenger remained exactly as he had throughout the morning. He read a magazine, accepted a cup of coffee, thanked the crew each time they stopped by. He never mentioned the incident. He never referred to his position. He traveled exactly as any other passenger would. After landing, the aircraft taxied to its arrival gate. The seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers stood and reached for their luggage. Normally, people hurried toward the exit. This time, many moved more slowly. Several waited until the quiet passenger had collected his small leather bag. As he stepped into the aisle, the older woman who had spoken during boarding smiled warmly. "I'm glad they finally did the right thing." He returned the smile. "So am I." Those 4 words were all he said. Nothing more. Near the aircraft door, the captain stood waiting. Not because company policy required it. Because he believed it was the right thing to do. As the quiet passenger approached, the captain spoke quietly. "Sir." The man stopped. "I've been thinking about the decisions we made today." The passenger listened without interrupting. The captain continued. "I cannot change what happened. No. But I can make sure I learn from it." The quiet passenger nodded once. "That matters." The captain extended his hand. The passenger shook it. Neither man spoke for several seconds. There was no audience. No cameras. Only 2 professionals acknowledging a difficult truth. Then the passenger picked up his bag and walked into the terminal. The formal review began before the aircraft was prepared for its next flight. Witness statements were collected. Security reports were filed. Cabin recordings were preserved. Training records were requested. The investigation focused on one question. Not why a passenger had behaved with prejudice. That answer was already clear. Instead, investigators examined why the response to that prejudice had placed the burden on the person who had done nothing wrong. Every decision was mapped in sequence. Every instruction was reviewed. The goal was not to assign blame quickly. It was to understand how experienced professionals working under time pressure had gradually chosen convenience over fairness. Several days later, employees across the airline received notice of updated guidance. The new training did not mention names. It did not mention Flight 318. It described only a principle. A cooperative passenger should never become the solution to another passenger's misconduct. The guidance included new procedures for handling discriminatory behavior before it could influence operational decisions. Managers were instructed to reinforce the policy during recurrent training. Crew members discussed the case privately. Many recognized pieces of their own decision-making in the investigation. The lesson spread quietly through the company. Only after the internal review had begun did most employees learn who the quiet passenger had been. Many were stunned, not because he owned the airline, but because he had never relied on that fact. He had allowed every employee to reveal their judgment without interference. The review measured the airline exactly as an ordinary traveler would have experienced it. That was the point. Weeks later, another flight boarded from the same airport. A different crew. A different group of passengers. Another disagreement began over assigned seats. This time, the lead flight attendant addressed the disruptive passenger first. The passenger following the rules was never asked to move. Boarding continued. The aircraft departed on time. No one on board knew that the procedure had changed because of a quiet man who had once stood alone near a forward galley, said almost nothing, and trusted that a fair system should not depend on knowing who you are. Sometimes the strongest changes begin without anger, without speeches, and without anyone realizing they are witnessing the moment that makes the future better.